Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. All of you are close friends of mine from the Environmental Status Program at Brown. But we were not there when Earth Day first got started, right? Most of us were barely born in 1970. But then in 1990, we were all in college studying to save the planet. As we moved into our first jobs, Earth Day continued to be a relevant thing, and especially for Chip, I think, right? When your career got started, it was really the launch of Earth Day 30. Tell us a little bit of what happened there.
So I think, like all of us on this call, I've always had these sort of deep passions around climate and the environment and communications. I've sort of married passion for the environment with journalism and communications. But for much of my youth and my time at Brown, I would communicate these things in I'm still an earnest person, but kind of an earnest, almost self-righteous way. After college, I worked at a publication called Greenwire in DC, which reached a very privileged few. And as Earth Day 2000 was coming around, I wanted to start something that would reach a broad set of folks. And I happened upon kind of a new tone, I guess I'd say, to apply to environmental communications, and that was to pair environment with humor and to kind of have some fun with this stuff. So I started an organization called Grist, which we call ourselves a beacon in the smog. And it was our goal from the very beginning to kind of usher in a new era of environmentalism and reach new audiences. So that happened as a part of Earth Day 2000. And I was fortunate to work with an individual named Dennis Hayes, who was the first organizer of Earth Day in 1970.
Great. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Chip. Rob, you and I worked on the recycling team at Brown, and that sort of launched some of what you were interested in, but that's not where you spend most of your time on now, right? Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, I got started in environmental work my first week in college when I was trying to find a place to recycle all the beer cans that my hall was generating. And I went to the Center for Environmental Studies and asked for a recycling barrel. And the people in charge kind of thought this was cute. And a week later, they offered me a job to work on the Brown recycling program. And then I switched my major over from development studies to environmental studies, and I never looked back. My first or second big outdoor experience was with Michael doing a 10-day backpacking trip in New Mexico, which I barely survived. And I guess what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. After college, I ended up working for the Green Lights program, which is an EPA voluntary energy efficiency program. It turned into the Energy Star program. And so a lot of people are familiar with the labels on dishwashers and electronic equipment for Energy Star. Now there's Energy Star buildings that are labeled. So I got interested in the connection between where we could make a profit and also protect the environment. Because I figured if we can't do those things, we should at least be doing those things. So I went to business school, worked for a bank for 2 years. That didn't work out all that well. I was trying to get them to do loans around energy efficiency, et cetera, and they thought I was kind of crazy. So I switched over to a small socially responsible investment firm called Green Century Capital Management. Did that for a few years, and Mindy Luber, who's the head of Ceres, where I now work, she helped to found that. And so she would sometimes call Green Century. I ended up getting hired by Ceres in 2006. Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit in Boston. We work on corporate sustainability and help investors with sustainability. Ever since my second week at Ceres, I've been helping to run a shareholder campaign, the power of shareholders to exert pressure on companies to do things like set greenhouse gas reduction goals, purchase renewable energy, adopt policies to protect tropical forests, and then even some niche things like addressing food waste and that sort of thing.
Thanks, Rob. Well, Rick, I remember many a late night conversation around energy issues, and climate change was just starting to be a huge issue. So you've taken that to rather interesting heights here, or levels of importance. So can you give us a little bit of a journey?
Thanks, Michael. And thanks for all the meals that you cooked for me for those late night sessions and midday sessions and every other kind of session. And I don't know that I ever reciprocated much, but that's probably for the best, because you were certainly the better cook then and now. So one of the things I remember most from those conversations was the back and forth that you and I would have about kind of working at the grand scale versus working at the micro scale. And I think we had a lot of good debate that we could continue right now, but don't have time for, about the merits of both. And obviously they both are valuable, and I think everyone would acknowledge that. But I always gravitated towards at least taking a run at trying to do things at the larger scale. And so recognizing that that was difficult and that there are a lot of downsides, including that you never really are quite sure what you've achieved when you're trying to grapple with things at a global scale. That was just always the draw for me, was to make that attempt. I guess partly with that in mind, as an undergrad, I combined looking into things from kind of an economics and business lens with the climate and environment lens. And I'll credit, by the way, Al Gore and Earth in the Balance with, I think, part of why climate was so top of mind for many of us back around 1990. Briefly worked in Central Bank of New York, then ended up in Honduras doing off-grid solar, which was fantastic for a while. Did green lights training while I was down there. Before I got into that, I tried to get into selling efficient lighting to Hondurans. And I had a great business pitch, except I didn't realize that nobody was really paying their electric bills. So that didn't work out as well as I'd hoped, because there was no savings to be had if you didn't have an electric bill to pay that you really cared about. So I moved on to off-grid solar, and then went to grad school and ended up then consulting, and then most recently in the Obama White House for the full 8 years. And it was really finally at that stage where I got a chance to have a crack at some of the sort of global scale problems that I'd always dreamed about engaging on. And it was the privilege of a career to really be able to work for a president who was as committed as he was to the climate question. And some of the wins that we had that I don't think are well appreciated. Just one example, I was the White House lead on the fight to get the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which I'm sure no one here has ever heard of except for the four of us. But it's a deal that we did manage to land under Obama that still is in place and happening, and it will eliminate, I would say, at least 0.3 centigrade of global warming from the whole picture. And it depends how you count it, but that's maybe 10% of the problem in one go. And so it is possible with committed, sustained effort and a president who cares and an administration that really gives their all to get that kind of thing done still. And I'm fundamentally optimistic that we'll be there again, hopefully very, very soon.
Great. Thanks, Rick. So if all three of you sort of think back over these last 20, 25 years, what do you feel are sort of the key new shifts that you've observed? Just looking at our screen, I see 4 white guys, talking about environmental issues. I think that's wasn't much of something we were terribly aware of in college, and nowadays we are noticing that.
I think we're kind of exiting an era that began with Reagan, which began to move away from sort of big structural changes that could address environmental challenges and more toward putting the onus on individuals and on, you guys might dispute this, but I'm sort of like believing in kind of tweaks in the market would bring about significant shifts in protecting the environment and addressing climate change. And I think much of that Earth Day 90, a lot of that was like 50 simple things you could do to protect the planet. Then in the early aughts, the early 2000s, when green was kind of the new black and we had an inconvenient truth, there was a lot of focus on, again, like changing light bulbs or acquiring electric vehicles and such like that. But I think what's really evident is we need structural big shifts. We need stuff like what Rick was talking at the government level. We need to really think about, you guys might dispute this, but is capitalism the way forward? Or if it is, we need big shifts to account for pollution, account for greenhouse gas emissions. And the other thing I'll say, so I think that's what the Green New Deal represents, is this idea of, if you look what we did in the 1930s in this country, in launching Social Security, in the conservation, the CCC, the conservation, like big governmental projects that also involve changing how the whole economy works. So that's one big shift. And the other thing I'll say, Michael, what you were alluding to is, you're right, for too long, the environment has sort of been seen as the province of the privileged. Conservation and protecting the environment is seen as a luxury. But it's in fact the less advantaged communities, poorer communities, many communities of color that are most confronted with environmental degradation, that most suffer from environmental harm, that are on the front lines of climate change. And so in a wonderful way right now, you're seeing the environmental movement almost being reimagined, reinvented as a climate justice movement. And leadership really coming from communities most affected by the challenges. And I think that's a great shift.
I agree with all that. I think with the possible exception of the capitalism piece, so I'll touch on that. I think that on the question of climate justice, environmental justice, I think that is an extraordinarily helpful development that we have in the US context, a recognition that there are lots of public health challenges that can be solved at the same time that we're addressing equity and climate, if we are creative about transforming our economy towards a cleaner future. And that is bringing in new blood, new energy, new constituencies, and all that opens up new political possibilities, which is incredibly helpful. I think it's worth just underscoring, though, that the whole topic of climate change always has been and always will be the biggest global environmental justice issue ever. And so to the extent that we as a country can really tackle this issue and then get back to leading the world towards tackling the issue, that is going to be most beneficial above all else to the rest of the world in Africa and Asia and Latin America, where you have the lion's share of low-income people globally and the most vulnerable accordingly. And so we have to view this in global context as well. And therefore, when things get tough, as they are right now with the recession, we can't let off the effort to deal with climate change. And we can't view it in narrow US-only economic terms. It is a global justice priority to deal with climate change. And it is also a domestic environmental justice priority to tackle it. I believe that the way to achieve the scale of change that's required has been and remains forceful government policy that basically takes what is otherwise a broken market where nobody's paying for pollution and converts it into a functioning market where the incentives are aligned and capitalists can function in a way that actually delivers both growth and climate health and broader environmental and public health. And so we have to have both capitalism and a lot of government to make sure that the capitalism is delivering all those things at the same time.
Thanks, Vic. Rob, that seems like a handoff to you. What do you make of that from a shareholder advocacy perspective?
Yeah, I agree 100% that we need public policies to solve climate change and to build on the momentum that we've got going. I've seen over my time in the space of sustainable investing, I've seen a kind of mainstreaming of the work. So it's now being called environmental, social, and governance investing. And you're seeing the corporate community do things like issue, the Business Roundtable issued the statement on the purpose of a corporation, where they said that this is 181 leading CEOs, largest corporations in the US. They said their purpose as a business is not just to help shareholders, which was the old model, shareholder primacy, but their purpose is to help stakeholders. And their stakeholders are their customers, their suppliers, their employees, communities, including the environment, and shareholders coming in last. So these are CEOs saying this. And then at the same time, you have the CEO of BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, owning, call it 5% of every company essentially in the markets because of their index funds. You have Larry Fink, the CEO there, saying this same message. We have to worry about climate change. We have to worry about stakeholders. And BlackRock even hired Brian Deese, who I think Rick worked closely with from the Obama White House. So seeing this mainstreaming of ESG is really exciting, but a lot of it's words so far. I mean, we're starting to see capital flows that are, helpful, and but the BlackRock stuff is mainly words so far. So I do an analysis every year of how the asset managers are voting on climate-related shareholder proposals. And I have a blog on Ceres.org that you can see the ranking of the asset managers. BlackRock votes for very few climate-related shareholder proposals. So their actions are out of step with their words. We're getting to the point in the capital markets where many people the leaders are starting to say the right things, and now we have to hold them accountable to their words so that they take the right actions. We are trying to bring the business voice to the policy debate, and we are working with investors, including the Unitarians. And Tim Brennan was the chief financial officer, and he's just retired, but he's still a consultant to the Unitarians. So we continue to work with him. So we help investors like the Unitarians file shareholder proposals with companies, asking them to disclose their lobbying, public policy work, and their spending. And we've gotten a number of companies to leave ALEC, a very harmful lobbying organization. So kudos to the Unitarians for using their investment dollars to help move companies, to bring those companies' influence into the policy debate.
Great. Well, just listening to you guys, I get sort of goosebumps of hope, because it seems like things are possible. Things are shifting in ways that towards environmental health and justice health. And what I'm also hearing is that we're in this for the long haul, right? This is not something that's going to get changed or solved in the next year or two, or the next administration or two. So let's turn this conversation a little bit more personal here. What sustains you personally in this work, that you've now done and dedicated your life to? Where do you ground yourself?
Michael, I go back to something one of our former roommates said. He said, life is about breathing, which is sort of obvious and relevant in the time of COVID-19. And so, breathing in is when you try really hard to achieve your goals, and breathing out is when you appreciate the beauty of the present moment and everything that we're blessed to have and be able to spend our time doing, et cetera, what we've got. I find that really useful as a grounding thought to both, solving climate change. There's so much at stake. At solving the virus problem, there's so much at stake. And you could drive yourself insane if you put the pedal to the metal 24 hours a day. So finding that balance and talking to you, Michael, about meditation, I think that's really helpful for keeping grounded.
I have a two-part answer. The first is, it relates to personal, Michael. Like, I was a couple of years ago, actually, in the midst of a 10-day silent meditation. I realized that part of my I don't really separate work from personal that much. And part of my work journey maybe had concluded, and that was raising awareness of how kind of messed up things are, and trying to activate people around concern. And so I've actually since then launched a project called Fix, which is about solutions. It's about where shift happens. It's about envisioning a planet that doesn't burn and a future that doesn't suck. And so a lot of our work with that project is lifting up solutions, lifting up the voices of solutions-oriented leaders who aren't as heralded as they ought to be. And what's incredible is, whether it's in the field of transportation or the built environment, or reimagining a new circular economy where the wastes of one product become the feed source for a new product. There's a ton of creativity out there. There's a whole array of people really working on what's the way out of this planetary pickle. So I find that personally really exciting, and is what I'm devoting my time to that story. And then like Rob, probably like all of us on this call, like meditation, it's hard, to fit it in each day with the kids and family, and this sort of boundaryless time right now in COVID-19, where work and family and, there's almost this like latent anxiety just surrounding us everywhere. It's hard to carve out time, but even just 10 or 15 minutes a day try to still one's mind and focus on breath, I'm finding really important.
Well, Chip, way to move the goalposts on me. I feel very good when I get in a 5-minute session every day. And it makes a difference to me to even just do that. So that brings me to the thing that sustains me, which is a feeling of real privilege and gratitude to be in a role where I can make some meaningful contribution to a problem that is unique in its scope and importance in certainly environmental domain, in the environmental domain. And also at the same time, absolutely solvable. The cost of getting this done is ultimately a rounding error relative to everything else that we invest in and need to accomplish. It is purely a question of political will and diplomatic effort. And that is an incredibly exciting and privileged conversation to be a part of, because we just have to break through those challenges and the rest will follow. And so, hope to be looking back at the end of my career, or at least the end of life, at having largely broken the back on this thing, because we can, and I think to some extent, I think we actually are getting there. And so it's going to be a fascinating ride, and I feel tremendous gratitude to be a part of the big global team that's trying to address it.
Listening to Rick, there's so many kind of interesting parallels between this time of this pandemic and I think the climate crisis that is heartening. I mean, counterintuitively kind of heartening, but I think coming out and in this time of the pandemic, it's sort of clear that science matters, that we can marshal resources when we're motivated to. I mean, if you look at the trillions of dollars within this country that have already been allocated to address this challenge. And then I think finally what Rick was kind of alluding to is like this fellowship. Like you can see human kindness, human compassion, human caring emerge out of this. And we're all learning we need to wear many different hats, like changing our kids' diapers while cooking, while working, all that. And I think that sort of resilience and flexibility and compassion and just fellowship is again where we're all finding some hope. And I think the pandemic's making that clear that we're one humanity.
Chip, I think you said it well here. As a closing comment, I was going to invite you all to reflect on what this all means, what COVID means for the environmental movement. But I think for now, let me just close it here. Thank you again for participating. And I really look forward to hanging out with you guys again in person here.